We're very concerned that Perth has a bright future, and in 2012 we released our document Towards a Bright Future, a vision for Perth as a region of 3.5 million people. And one of the very top-line recommendations was for government to have an integrated land use and transport plan. So we're very pleased to have Eric Lumsden, the Chairman of the West Australian Planning Commission, as our keynote speaker today to talk about government's plans for the region at 3.5 million. We're also going to have a panel session with Gal McGowan, the Director-General of the Department of Planning. And we're going to have a stand-in for Reece Waldock from the Department of Transport. And we're also going to have Ipsos, Sally Bradwood from Ipsos is going to tell you about our Perth Perception Survey results, and we've had really good media on that this morning. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our next major project, so we've got a really packed program. When the Committee for Perth thinks about the future of Perth, one of the things that we've written in our RAP over several years now is that we want Perth to be the city in Australia that acknowledges, respects and celebrates Aboriginal people and their culture. And on that note, can I please ask Dr Richard Walley, OAM, to come and give a welcome to country.
Kaiwa. Ngara Japan jeneng nanak jenengan ngara boja nanak jenengan wajak boja ngara mot boja nanak wangin karajin wangin nganin wangin kep wangin maman jeneng nanak kaiwa berwan nanak wot ko nanak kalak nanak boja nanak mot maman jeneng nanak ngara mot boja nanak kot boja jenengan ngara yai berwan nanak wot ko nanak kalak boja mot maman jeneng nanak kaiwa. So may the good spirit be with each and every one of you. Watch over you in this presentation, what we're doing, gathering, planning, sharing food, sharing ideas and conversation is something that all of us have been doing for thousands of years, not only here in this location on the Wajak area, but each of you from your ancestry have done the same thing. So I ask the good spirit and the spirit of my ancestor and yours to watch over us, guide us through this presentation, give those the ability to present their message and articulate the message they want to deliver, and those who receive it, the capacity to pass it on to those who require it. Also, may the good spirit take each and every one of you safely back home to your families at the end of this day, and of course, safely back to your work at the end of this presentation. I'd like to thank the Committee for Perth for requesting a welcome to country. In our culture and our community, it's a sign of respect, and respect is our greatest currency. So I do a little song for you. This one is by the river, and I'd I do the welcome on behalf of the Wajak people and my family who are associated to this region. Bilja calling ye, quapen calling ye, ngala boy ye, bilja calling a warden ye. Bilja calling a warden ye, cardamorn warden ye, cardacomba calling ye, bilja calling ye. Kaiwa, Mama Janang, may the good spirit be with you.
Thank you, Richard. Richard has worked alongside us for many years now, and we're now working on our third Reconciliation Action Plan with Richard's guidance as well. So we thank him for his ongoing work and guidance with the Committee for Perth. He makes sure that we don't put a cultural foot wrong, and that's very important to us. So we're going to talk about the future of Perth. Perth and Peel at 3.5 million people. We've got so many dignitaries in the room, so let me start by saying to Richard Muirhead, the Chairman of the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, welcome. And I did tell Richard that I was going to the National Anzac Centre last week, and I think you've done a brilliant job, so congratulations. Paul White, the Director-General of the Department of Regional Development. We've got a number of mayors from local government here, so Sue Doherty, Brad Pettit, Joe Dawkins, I saw Carol Adams before, and we've also got representatives from the City of Gosnells, Armidale, Melville and Kwinana, so welcome one and all. And to our Chairman, John Langalont, AO, Deputy Chair Gay McMath, who I saw over there, Directors Linda Wayman, Julius Mathias and Abra de Klerk, welcome everybody. I'm going to invite our chairman to the stage to present a number of new member plaques, which is really pleasing that the Committee for Perth continues to grow in terms of the financial support that allows us to do the very good thinking work that we do when we're thinking about the Perth of the future. So John, could you please come up? And I'm going to call out each organisation and the representative who will receive the plaque. John will present that to them, and then Chris is going to take a photograph, and he's down the front here. So a corporate member of the Committee for Perth, our newest one, is the Bendigo Bank, and that's a contribution of $27,500 a year, so not an insignificant amount. So Simone Yule, could you please come up and receive the certificate? And Simone, I don't know how handy you are, but there's a record of under an hour to get that hung up on the wall. So
I'm not very handy.
And also Ipsos has joined us as an executive member. So Sally Broadwood, if you could come up, please. Sally's the Director of Public Affairs and, as I said, has worked on supervising the most recent Perth Perception Survey, and she'll take you through some of the really fascinating and I think very pleasing results of that survey. And a number of business members. So for Mercy Care, could I please have Chris Hall come up? And Chris is probably one of our quickest sign-ups. He came to a prospective member breakfast, and within a couple of weeks we had his membership form, so we're really pleased about that. Transfield Services, Sunny Hay, who's their Business Development Manager. Sunny here? No, we've got a nod at the back of the room, so we'll hold that off. And City of Armidale have recently joined, and Ray Tame, their CEO, is going to receive the certificate. All right, I'm going to ask John just to say a few words about membership. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here. And punctuality was enormous, I must say, when I arrived 10 to 12, and all of you were here before me. I thought, gee, that's good. It's not only good because the Committee for Perth really does depend on your participation at events like today. And as Marion said, this is our second largest audience. And as I look across everyone who's here today, it really is a nice broad representation of the West Australian community. So we're delighted about that. Congratulations to those who've just become members of the Committee for Perth, and congratulations on receiving the plaque, and good luck in getting those plaques up within an hour. Every time I have the opportunity of talking with you, my encouragement to you always is to stay with organisations like the Committee for Perth. The committee does valuable work on your behalf across many areas of this community to bring about the goals and the purpose to which you support this organisation. In tough economic times, it really is important that membership stays with organisations like the Committee for Perth, because it's these times we do our really best work. It's easy in the good times to be a member. If you really are a dedicated member to organisations, then stay with us during the tough times. We'll reward you in terms of all of the progress which you're seeing across the city and the work which gets done on your behalf. So thank you again. We really do value your membership and your ongoing support of the Committee for Perth, and I hope you enjoy the lunch.
Thank you very much. So congratulations to all of our new members, and we look forward to welcoming some more at our next lunch. We've got a very packed program today, so we're going to make things sort of very lively. I'm going to ask Sally to come up and present the results of the Perth Perception Survey while your main meal's being served. We're going to give you a little breather, a little networking time, and then I'm going to ask Eric to come up and provide the keynote address. And then we're going to go into the panel session, of which I've asked Sally to join as well, because there'll be some issues I think that you'll want to discuss and drill down into some of the survey results, as well as ask some of our government leaders how the implementation of thinking about Perth as a region of 3.5 million is going. And then we're going to finish up with a vote of thanks from Liz Kerry at RAC, and we promise to have you out of here on time. So without further ado, Sally, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Marion, and good afternoon. I too would like to start by acknowledging and thanking the traditional custodians of the land where we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar people. It's a real pleasure to be here today to share with you the findings of the Perth Perception Study. It's a study we ran recently on behalf of the Committee for Perth, and it's something we ran first about 3 years ago in 2012. It came about in terms of wanting to understand how do residents feel about living here in Perth? Are they satisfied? Would they recommend that other people live here as well? And really importantly, what are those things that are driving satisfaction about living here in Perth? What do people love about being here? And so recently we found ourselves about 3 years down the track in what I'm sure you'll agree is a vastly changing city. And so we thought it was really timely to check back in with residents and just to find out what's changed. Are they still feeling the same? And if things have changed, are there in fact different things that are perhaps driving satisfaction or lack of with living here in Perth? And so we spoke to over 500 Perth Metro residents, and in fact some of you in the room may have taken part. I know we sent the survey out through Committee for Perth's network, so you might have gotten the email and clicked on the link and hopefully completed the survey. We also spoke to a really broad range of residents to make sure we got the full gamut of age and gender and where they lived in the Perth metro area, just so we could be really sure that the results and the perceptions do reflect our society here in Perth. So before we go too far into the findings, I want to set a little bit of context around what's happening generally here in WA and how we compare to the rest of the country. So we run at Ipsos an issues monitor. We've been running it since 2010, and we speak to people every quarter to understand what's important here in WA. This is the list of issues that we track and we've been tracking across time, and you can see from many of those there, they're really relevant to the types of things that we're here to talk about today. And so this data shows you from 2012 in that first box on the left through to 2015 now, what are the topical things here in WA for people? And if we look at what's changed since 2012 and what's the same, so the top two issues are still the same. The two there in the light blue and the green, and that's crime and cost of living. Western Australia compared to the rest of the country is quite peculiar in that crime is always a top concern. We don't have a higher crime rate, but it's certainly more top of mind for people. And they're still the top two issues, crime and cost of living. What we can also see is that healthcare in the orange and housing in the grey are pretty consistent in terms of how they were sitting in 2012 in people's minds in terms of importance. And also in dark blue there is transport. And it's interesting to see there was a spike around the last election in 2013 when we know that transport was certainly a key issue, and it came through in the results there. Something interesting to look at across time, though, is the difference in the increasing importance that we can see around the economy in pink and also unemployment in yellow. So they're two things that now, compared to 2012, are more top of mind in terms of importance for people. Now, certainly today we've got a focus on transport and infrastructure, so we've pulled that out to look at how it compares here in Western Australia to some other key states. So in the yellow there you can see Victoria, and looking at the different states, we've got Victoria, New South Wales in the grey, Western Australia in the orange, and then Queensland in the green. And we can see that across all the different states, it's certainly in Victoria, where transport at the moment is the hottest issue. WA and New South Wales pretty much on par, and then it's Queensland where it's a little bit lower in terms of importance. So that's a bit of context set, and now I'd like to take you through some of the results of the research that we ran with Committee for Perth. We started by asking that key question, how satisfied are you with living here in Perth? And what you can see on the screen, the bottom bar is 2012 results and the top bar is 2015. And what's very encouraging is that satisfaction with living here in Perth has actually increased in the past 3 years. And it's not only increased overall, but the strength of satisfaction has increased. So we've got more people in that dark green box, which tells us they're more down towards the 8, 9, 10 out of 10 in terms of how satisfied they are with living here in Perth. We also asked people, okay, you're satisfied, but how likely are you to say to others that Perth is a great place to live and recommend it as a place to live? And this, we use the NPS style question, which many of you may use for different business metrics. And basically we get to people, how likely are you to recommend Perth as a place to live on a 0 to 10 scale? If you're from 0 to 6, you fall into the bucket that we call detractors. If you're a 7 or 8, you're in that middle passive bucket. And then if you're a 9 or 10 out of 10, you're what we call a promoter. And by taking detractors away from the promoters, we're left with a core number, an NPS score. And you can see in 2012 it was plus 17. And again, really encouragingly, this year in 2015, we're sitting at plus 28, which is a significant increase in terms of residents' likelihood to recommend Perth as a place to live. So that was 2 key pieces of positive information that we found straight away and thought, great, let's dig deeper and find out what it is that people like about living here in Perth. And so we showed residents that list of characteristics that are down the left-hand side, and we asked them to tell us how closely these characteristics reflect life in Perth today. And what you can see in the dark blue is the 2015 results, and then in the grey is the 2012 results. The green and the red circles indicate the green is a positive shift, significant shift positively, and the red is a negative shift. And so what's interesting, certainly life in Perth today is still consistent with 2012. It's really dominated by our great weather, our outdoor and laid-back friendly lifestyle. These are all really strong associations that have stayed strong over time. But what we're seeing is quite interesting towards the bottom is that Perth is now beginning to transition. So while in 2012 it was more seen to be traditional and perhaps a bit old-fashioned, we're now transitioning to be seen more so as a modern and contemporary city that's suited to young people. We gave some more characteristics to people to look at, and from this slide we can see a few more negatives are creeping in at this point. Public transport, it was rated low in 2012 and it hasn't shifted to 2015. We can also see that in terms of being seen as an environmentally friendly city, we've actually gone backwards in residents' perceptions. And similarly, residents are telling us that life in Perth is still too expensive, we're low on affordability, and that we've failed to diversify our economy, and that's actually lower than 2012. But there is a good news story as well. So you can see that compared to 2012, Perth is more associated with being safe and also more associated with having good health and welfare systems. And certainly we know that in the time from 2012, many hospitals and health initiatives have been announced and they're actually starting to come online as well now. So while we can look back at that 2012 data to try and understand what's changed, it's also interesting to ask the question directly to residents and get them to tell us whether they think this is in fact a changing city. And so we did. We said, thinking back over the last 10 years, would you say things in Perth have changed for the better, the worse, or have they stayed the same? And overwhelmingly, residents told us that things have changed for the better here in Perth. 7 out of 10 ticked that box in terms of, yep, things have changed for the better. And we also showed them, we gave them a list of initiatives or events, things that have happened over that 10-year period, and asked them to tell us, well, what impact have these changes had? Have they been positive? Have they been negative? And what's very interesting, if you look at the very first thing at the top of that list, it's the Perth to Mandurah rail line that came through as having the most positive impact in Perth over the last 10 years, which is quite considerable considering it's quite some time since that project was completed. Other positives are things like cultural changes, so Fringe Festival came up as really positive, more small bars, deregulated shopping hours, and also an increase in hospital infrastructure are more positives that have had an impact here in Perth. You can see at the bottom of that list 2 polarising events, and that's economic changes and population growth. So they're polarising in that people, there's a good group of residents saying it's been positive, but similarly there's a good group saying that it's been a negative change. So that's the present and the past covered off. Really important to ask, what do people want for the future? And so we used the same list of attributes or characteristics, and we asked, well, how important are these for the future of Perth? And here you can see, again, we've got 2012 versus 2015, and a lot of similarities to what's current at the moment. So we can see for the future, it's definitely still going to revolve around our natural assets and our outdoor lifestyle. Something interesting, that red dot there is relating to lower density living. And we can see that compared to 2012, fewer residents have told us that low density living is important for our future. This is a significant shift for Perth in terms of a mindset. Certainly a lot of other work we do, we know that high density is a bit of a dirty word or a dirty phrase. It scares people. They don't know what it means. They have visions of high rises and losing what it means to be living in Perth and that outdoor lifestyle and that laid back lifestyle. So that shift is interesting to look at and perhaps a change in mindset for residents. We gave them, again, the other list of attributes, and here we can see all those green circles, really high scores. These are the things that are really important for the future of Perth. And so in this list, there's things like an efficient public transport system, good aged care, education, a range of housing choices, safety and affordability. And if we look at what's less important, very interestingly, and a surprise to nobody, but it's nice to see it reflected in the data, that a future less dependent on the resources sector is what's in the minds of people in Perth. So what's particularly interesting is if we look at these two big questions, we ask what are the strongest assets or perceptions of life in Perth at the moment, and what do you want for the future? And it's when we look at these two lists side by side that we get a sense of perhaps the greatest areas of focus needed for the future. And so here's that first list, so the top 10 strongest perceptions of life in Perth today. And that's pleasant weather, a place that's suitable for families, outdoor-orientated active lifestyle, mining resources-focused economy, value sports for recreation and entertainment, laid-back lifestyle, good education, friendly and welcoming, a place that's suitable for older people, and good health and welfare systems. So that's the current. And of course we asked about the future, the top 10 importance for the future, and that's an efficient public transport system, good education, safe, good health and welfare systems, friendly and welcoming, a place that's suitable for families, affordable, pleasant weather, environmentally friendly, and good aged care. The first thing you can see from those two lists, they're quite different in terms of where we're performing most strongly as a city at the moment and what's most important for our future. And so we did what we loosely called a gap analysis to look at the weight of importance for the future compared to how we're currently performing to really identify the top 5 areas of focus for the future. And so they are affordable place to live, efficient public transport system, diverse economy, environmentally friendly, and good aged care. So these are the 5 areas that are simultaneously the most important to Perth's future from the perspective of residents, but also the least associated with life in Perth today. So I'll leave you on those notes. Hopefully it gives you an idea of how residents are feeling, what they're seeing, and what's important to them. Enjoy the rest of the day and the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. So I hope that's given lots of food for thought and discussion. I will leave you to have your lunch. But as you can see, very important information for the Committee for Perth, for our board and for our working groups in terms of where we need to focus our energy as well. So enjoy your lunch and we'll be back with Eric shortly. Okay, we're going to make a start. I think nearly all of you have got your meals. Many of you have just about finished them. So let's get on to the main attraction. Now, many of you would know Eric as the Chairman of the West Australian Planning Commission, or have dealt with him previously as Director General of the Department of Planning, or over the many years in local government. So he's known, I'm sure, as someone who is deeply respected, incredibly knowledgeable about the planning system. I find him as Chair of the Heritage Council incredibly pragmatic. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation on government's response in terms of planning for Perth at $3.5 million. Eric.
Thank you, Marion, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd also like to join the Committee of Perth in acknowledging Dr Richard Wally for his welcome to country and the traditional landowners of the land of Whadjuk and Noongar people. And I'm pleased to be here, of course, to present this overview of Perth and Peel at 3.5 million. I'd also like to compliment, before I get into my presentation, the Committee for Perth for its research, particularly today's research and past research, which the Commission looks forward to. And it's something that we need to absorb, but also at times it complements our own research, which is welcome. The third point I'd like to make is that I will be making some comments today, which will, at times, and you'll be able to pick it up, will be my personal view and not necessarily government policy. but I have been told I'm an independent chairman of the West Australian Planning Commission, so I like to, at times like this, to use that independence. So I'll move on. And I've tried to address this presentation from a diagnostic and responsive approach. And I suppose the first point I'd want to make is that the Commission acknowledges that a plan is a plan, and it's important that it can be implemented. And when you do planning such as this for the longer term, it cannot be implemented overnight and requires the goodwill and cooperation of many people. But in terms of background to urban expansion, I wish to touch on both a geographical and environmental context. And I noticed the environment was picked up in the research just done recently for the Committee for Perth. The demographic growth since the 1960s and its implications is certainly different to when we were planning 30, 40 years ago. Housing affordability and aspects and impacts on livability or one's quality of life is becoming increasingly focused and important, and is certainly vulnerable to issues in like movements in interest rates, people's acquisition to superannuation, as well as other economic aspects. Our water supply, its catchments, are under stress and under increasing demand, and added to that is the impacts of climate change and rainfall. And whilst we've had probably a good August rainfall, it's still about 20% below the average for August. Our basic raw materials are not an ongoing resource, they are finite, and that has become more and more apparent. Infrastructure, not only the use of the current infrastructure, but the future infrastructure is becoming more critical to evaluate and to maximise. Our economic productivity across Australia and Western Australia is becoming a greater issue, and it's important therefore we respond to that issue where we can from a planning context. And obviously environmental issues and the approval processes associated with long planning reforms will be an ongoing issue. Our urban expansion, shown by these slides, since 1925, when Perth was basically, one could class, a small country town of around 66 kilometres, moving out to 74 to 378 kilometres and now to 870 kilometres, but with a coastal spread of around 150 kilometres. And I know that's a long way because I travel 200 kilometres a day, backwards and forwards from my place of residence. We obviously have had a good strategic and statutory framework for relevant acts. You can see there, and perhaps the most recent ones showing the impact and acknowledgement that planning works within environmental context is shown by our own EPA Act in 1986 and more recently the Commonwealth's Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999. And evolution of our planning documents, as shown on that slide, to where we are today goes back to a long time when, from the embryo Stevenson plan right through to other plans such as Metro Plan, Corridor Plans, Network City, etc., to those we have today. And a lot of the issues have been similar but are now compounding. So in terms of planning, changing planning parameters from 2010, and I've chosen that date because that was the directions 2031 and beyond, which was put out in 2010, which has received quite large public and government response and support. The parameters is looking beyond 2031 now out to somewhere around 2050, where Perth's expected to have around about 3.5 million population, and for Marion's benefit, that's Barcelona. So observe. But certainly the changing our demographic changes are significant, both for migration and the ageing, and there's plenty of literature around to support that. Having broader impacts in terms of the health budget, but also in terms of other aspects relating to housing choice. Affordability not only for the young, but also for the aged. Ensuring that our livability and lifestyles are improved. In other words, our quality of life is advanced, not detracted from. And we have issues between the environmental issues and the cost of infrastructure, etc., of infill versus greenfield, although they need to be complementary. But above all, we need to provide not only an ongoing improvement of lifestyle and amenity, but we need to provide, which people expect, the choice, having a diversity of choice, as well as enhancing our infrastructure and adding value to the supporting underlying social and economic frameworks we have. There's no doubt that infrastructure, through our planning frameworks over time, have increased in terms of the cost to provide and the cost to maintain. And people seem to forget that public transport is subsidised, and the gap or the increase in subsidisation is increasing, not decreasing, especially when we operate within an economic climate which is putting stresses on all governments, state and federal, regardless of their political persuasion, and that those issues are not going to go away, certainly in the short term. But certainly from an economic point of view, we need to enhance our activity centres, whether it's the Perth CBD, as well as the regions such as Joondalup, Coburn, Morley, Canning, Midland, Armidale and Melville, etc., which are developing well, and as intended to be done from our planning. Our major industrial areas are still an important component to ensure they can operate effectively through good transport, but also ensuring good planning and decision making so that they're not eroded, and that we increase the ability for people to have choice of employment in activity centres, as well as recognising the huge opportunity for employment now and in the future, not only in the Perth CBD, but in what I call the inner ring of our suburbs, which is basically bounded by Roe and Reed highways. BRM resources, or basic raw materials, are resources which are not going to be always there in terms of as we've had them in the future, particularly sand and limestone, where most resources are to the north of the river, but will be, at some time in the future, expire. And of course we have congestion in terms of car ownership. It's also how we manage traffic, as well as ensuring an integrated public transport system. In terms of the environmental aspects, that's good. Haven't got eyes in the back of my head yet. Certainly the environment is something that the community demands and expects, and again picked up in that survey which we had results from. And they want good air quality. They want good natural environments to be retained. And they want to have good places in which to live and interact with their own local environment. There's obviously been an issue in terms of impacts on coming to address these issues far more effectively, because previous plans we've had in terms of industrial land, for instance, have had to be adjusted because we didn't have the information that we perhaps should have done at the time. And we need to address these issues from a whole of government perspectives in line with the community. And those issues, environment, while we can look at them singularly or just as a small part in our local environment, are actually interrelated now from what I call a systems approach, where many issues facing Perth now and in the future and the Peel region actually transcend region and local government boundaries, and such as the Peel-Harvey catchment, which is now under stress and has been recognised as such recently by the Chief Scientist of WA. And above all, we are now being able to benefit from extensive data collection and analysis, which perhaps we didn't have to the same degree of 10, 15 years ago. So we see this plan as hopefully being a second generation Stevenson plan, but far more effective in terms of research, and also far more balanced in recognising and accepting their challenges for the future over the next 30 to 50 years. We do have urban growth boundaries, and I suppose the most extreme one, which I might say is rather flippant, is called the Indian Ocean. So unless we're going to fill it in, it is a boundary. We also have boundaries such as our regional open space, Kings Park, other reserves, state forest, and the Metropolitan Region Scheme, which is the statutory underpinning for our planning, actually recognises and brings those elements together in a reflection of how and where growth may occur.
Our transport is obviously very significant, both from heavy rail and major roads, but our freight dimension in terms of movement of roads on freight as well as rail is expanding exponentially because of the development of Perth and Peel as a region. And of course, public transport is a key factor to be recognised for planning for in the future. So if we look at the corridor and the railway corridors analysis of constraints and opportunities, and I'm going to take some time to do this, because unless we have detail involved in both local but also regional planning, it's not recognised perhaps as such as one would speak. So I'm going to address all of these corridors and outline to you what is the state of play today. And the first one is the central area. Now that's a pretty busy slide, and it's in one of the documents produced by the Department of Planning for the Commission. But that area has in the past and will continue for some time in the future to have the majority of employment. It also has a variety of housing diversity. It also, in conjunction with the Perth CBD, is a significant focus for people wanting to have a choice of housing and diversity of living within that area because they're close to employment. It also has the maximum accessibility to public transport, and has a number of activity corridors shown in the blue which can be enhanced in terms of their scope and variety in terms of land use to maximise the benefit from existing public transport, not just heavy rail or future light rail, but certainly the bus movements. But above all, it is certainly going to be ongoing for a long period of time as the major area of employment outside the broader sub-regional activity centres for the Perth and Peel region. So it's an important component on which to plan and for ensure that we meet the demands of the current and the future population. The northwest region, that is going up to Yanchep. It's long been planned for urban development and was zoned accordingly a long time ago by the past Minister Richard Lewis. It comprised of very large land ownership parcels and has been and will continue for some time to be a major growth corridor of Perth. It's characterised by large lots with the exception of East Wanneroo, which is in the pale or duck egg green, or what do you want to call it, this area here, which is largely fragmented holdings. It also has areas which are demanding water resources to service the active open space in that area, which will continue to be an ongoing demand. It also has environmental impacts in terms of Nangara Mound, the state forests, as well as other environmental issues associated with the National or the Commonwealth's Environmental Protection Act. And so much so that we've had to refine some of our previous plans, around, wrong button, around Nirrumbuk, etc., because of issues not only with environmental aspects but also with ensuring we don't sterilise basic raw materials such as sand and limestone. So this data we've been receiving over a period of time through this planning exercise carried out by the Department of Planning in conjunction with other agencies. It has involved an immense amount of data and has often shown to us we had to refine previous assumptions we had in terms of our plans. Now move to the northeast corridor. Now this corridor is obviously typified with very strong catchments, particularly the Swan and Canning catchment, individual town sites such as Mundaring, Mount Helena, etc., the foothills, protected Swan Valley, Allenbrook, and then up into the Broolsbrook. All this area has significant environmental constraints, drainage, Pallas Plain soils, and the like, and fragmented holdings. So but having said that, whilst Allenbrook has surged ahead as one or two large holdings, we have had urban consolidation in this corridor here, Henley Brook, etc., which included fragmented land holdings. Over time, the development industry has responded to that, but there are significant drainage issues in that area, particularly as you move further to the north. But there is opportunities for industrial development around the Perth National Highway, as well as maximising other economies of scale through the transport network. In terms of the South Metropolitan Region, the South West Corridor, which is this corridor down to Mandurah, Rockingham, etc., is now dealing with a degree of fragmentation of lots, but also with other environmental issues, and particularly as you move from the west to the central area, say west to east, and from east to west, all this area here is subject to not only fragmented lots, but significant drainage issues, as well as nutrient issues affecting the Peel-Harvey catchment. And for those who don't know, this is the Peel-Harvey catchment. Goes down there and right around. It is massive. It is equivalent to half of the general area of the Perth and Peel region schemes. There are not only fragmented lots in terms of the South West Corridor and the South East Corridor and drainage issues, but we need to manage those drainage and environmental issues very carefully. Otherwise, the issues resolved by the Dawesville Cut, in terms of the Peel-Harvey Inlet, will manifest itself again in the future and more severely, with major social, economic and environmental impacts. So, all these aspects have been reflecting the current situation and need to be, and recognised to be, an input to future planning for Perth at 3.5 million. Very clearly, because of these environmental constraints, infrastructure constraints, drainage constraints, etc., we now need a consolidated approach to be further enhanced as set out in Directions 2031 and beyond. The geographic and environmental issues now transcend the regions and general localities. This is particularly in the catchment areas, as well as other aspects of the geographic nature of Perth and Peel. Our population growth and demographic trends will continue, and this has been clearly shown not only within the intergenerational reports, but as shown in our demographic analysis for all local governments. And in particular, that will occur in the western suburbs, and also ongoing in a longer term in our more developing local governments. So demographic change will present challenges, as they are today, but they will be increasing challenges. Planning for the needs of a city with more than 1 million people, which eventually involves making decisions about location and development of infrastructure, will be in place a long-term endeavour. Also, population growth, even though it may be sometimes consistent, it can be erratic and is normally associated with changes for net overseas migration. But notwithstanding the growth of Perth, whether it increases or decreases, demographic change is occurring within our communities and will continue. Planning, therefore, involves more than just gauging the size of a future population. And I want to stress this. It's not a matter of planning for growth. The changes in demographic structure between the census suggest that we have clear changes in the way in which we form families and households. Population ageing is caused by higher fertility and lower mortality, as well as the baby boomer phenomenon. There's been improvements in healthcare, again came out in this survey just recently conducted. Medicines and our knowledge that work to increase our lifespan to what we knew, say, 20, 30 years ago. This is a long pattern, which will, apart from the lull in the 50s and 60s, and the odd year or two since then, has shown a remarkable, consistent increase in the number of years that a baby can expect to live. Infant mortality rate, which was 110 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1906, has now decreased exponentially to just under 5 in 2006. And health issues have been a major driver of this improvement. The effect of mortality, fertility, combined with a large number of babies born after the Second World War, has resulted in a significant ageing of the population. The proportion of the population aged 65 and over has grown from 9% in 1986 to 12% in 2011 and will increase dramatically from up to 2026 and beyond, irrespective of population growth. So these are important factors that planning of land use today needs to take into account. We also need to look at our economic development, a key issue for development of not only Australia but our state, but equally into our ability to fund improvements to our lifestyles. Certainly that economic development needs to be reinforced in the city of Perth, the metropolitan area generally, but also in our other activity centres, our industrial areas, our corridors, in order that our planning can make a positive contribution to the growth of GDP. We also need to look at how we can implement the plans. We need coordination and alignment, and above all we need prioritisation, which is considered not only from today's perspective but also for tomorrow's perspective. In other words, how we can add the greatest value to our decision making. And that links into how we stage and sequences development, whether it's from urban development, industrial development, as well as infrastructure. But above all, we need aligned whole of government response on behalf of the community, not only today's community, but just as importantly, in my view, more importantly, for the future community. So the key drivers are, for our plans of 3.5 million people, is to give as much as possible certainty for an urban, industrial and rural development, to address proactively, not reactively, ecological environmental concerns and issues which are before us because of climate change associated with reducing rainfall, warmer summers, stronger climatic events such as the wind, floods and bushfires we see occurring now. And the demographic change is from two components: the ageing of the population I've mentioned, but also to the changing desires of our younger people, X, Ys and Zs. And then to take that into account and look at our infrastructure demands in terms of both current and recurrent costs, which are ongoing costs to the community, so that we can have an integrated infrastructure approach, not an isolated one solution fits all approach, which has regard to the compounding impacts, not only on terms of servicing our population, but just as importantly as servicing the cost of running and maintaining that infrastructure. Maintaining an asset is just as important, if not more critical in some cases, than simply adding to the infrastructure to the existing asset. And so this approach we're doing is the beyond component to our past Perth Directions 21 and beyond. So in terms of key future issues as I see it, and it really addresses a fundamental component of the Planning Development Act, which is not perhaps mentioned, is to ensure that our planning gives sustainability to the community, but also sustainability from the wider sense of the word in terms of what we're planning in terms of integrated land use planning. We need to look at that implementation and look for effective solutions and different solutions where they're applied, to look at how we stage and sequence development in infrastructure so it adds value, but where possible it integrates all aspects of infrastructure, particularly in terms of public transport, not just heavy rail, not just roads, not light rail, but equally buses and walking and other passive aspects which need to be brought into that equation. We need to look at how we plan our places. We need to ensure that that planning is the highest possible outcomes in terms of amenity and choice, but above all, reinforce our green spaces. And in some cases, in our existing urban areas, we need to maximise and perhaps re-green areas which perhaps aren't as green as they should be. Urban design is a critical aspect. Planners in the past have looked at urban design perhaps from a very insular, two-dimensional approach. Urban design involves a 3D approach. Not only is good design essential in terms of its appearance, but it's also good design in terms of the amenity it adds to and in fact provides, but also ensures that we have a better living space and integrated living spaces. and that may require a different approach in the future to our current planning codes, particularly along the corridors, to perhaps more of a form-based or smart-based code, something we've got to look at. House affordability, associated with livability and providing diversity of housing is going to be a key ongoing issue, and it will not diminish. It can be subject to fluctuations in the economic climate, such as interest rates. And I'm conscious that a wide number of people who may be asset rich but liquidity poor because their superannuation will not sustain them in terms of longer term of their lifespan. And certainly we are now hitting thresholds in terms of abilities for people to pay for housing, particularly our younger people, even if they're on double incomes. But people who are on single incomes, whether they're young or aged, are now under housing stress. Economic development I've mentioned, but we need to ensure that whatever we do, we get the best value in terms of our decision making, and particularly have regard to the use of our basic raw materials. In terms of transport planning and implementation, I've mentioned all the aspects there. I've mentioned freight task, but we need to take clearly an integrated approach to transport planning, not just a one-mode-fits-all approach or one-solution approach. In terms of key priorities for the Planning Commission, we need, even more so now, to be planning ready for the future as much as possible. And so the Commission needs to move very vigorously and actively into sub-regional and local planning in conjunction with local government where appropriate. We need to focus on ensuring that our strategic planning supports our statutory planning, and that the Commission has the capability to strategically plan effectively in the future. That also includes the integration of land use and transport planning in terms of our solutions for future development, as well as promoting housing diversity to meet an increasing and diverse ongoing demand, to ensure our infrastructure reservations are there as in the past but also for the future, to ensure that we enhance our corridors of infrastructure, to ensure duplication of land does not occur, and above all ensure that the sound infrastructure planning, whether it's power, water supply, sewer, etc., is feasible in terms of longer term and can be in place in a timely way. That requires significant action in terms of coordination of the implementation works. And above all, drainage management is becoming an ongoing issue, particularly south of Perth, to ensure that we manage our catchments well, both from an underground water as well as a surface water point of view. That means we'll need over this planning horizon targeted action priorities. Some will involve City of Stirling, Fremantle, which is being proactive now, Armidale, Mandurah and Yanchep, to ensure that those frameworks are enhanced and consolidated. Improved strategic policy development, working with local government and other government agencies so we have the right policies in place to meet the changing needs, as well as significant ongoing private sector liaison so we can share and enhance our skills, knowledge and learnings, such as we've seen today in the earlier presentation. And above all, to ensure we have the appropriate data, which we found we need from the involvement we've had in terms of the strategic environmental assessment process. So what are the key messages? Perth and Peel's outward growth is now creating unsustainable demand on the state's resources, social and physical infrastructure, its services and the natural environment. We are now hitting thresholds. Those thresholds will not be going away and they can't be manipulated without proactive involvement. Hence, the Commission, with the support of the Department of Planning, has developed the suite of documents to create a dynamic, vibrant and livable city. Again, what the wider community want and need in the future. We're endeavouring to define the shape of Perth by proposing cooperatively where possible where houses and jobs can be located, better use of proposed and existing infrastructure and protecting important environmental assets. This does not lead to a shortage of land. We have sufficient land to accommodate our population growth to 3.5 and beyond by 2050 or whatever the date may be. But whatever we do, We have to ensure we have greater housing affordability, diversity and choice. Not just for me or you, but for our children and our grandchildren. That is what this is really, really about. Currently, almost 80% of housing stock is in the form of detached houses and urban fringes, and that will not meet the overall desires of the future community which we're planning for. We need around 800,000 new dwellings to accommodate the extra people, and bearing in mind overall family size is decreasing. And therefore, approximately half of that should be 380,000, not 3 million, will be through strategic infill development. So we need to provide that greater housing choice for an ageing population and, above all, increasingly diverse households. Housing affordability does not always equal living affordability. Transport costs can be significant, and particularly in terms of time and money. A lot of young people want to be time rich, not time poor. And whilst substantial greenfield can take place, we'll be making greater use of activity centres, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, one key message I want to leave to you today, and I say this not from a government perspective, but I say from a personal perspective. I'm now in my 51st year of planning. That's a long time when I've put it in those. I've been in terms of local and regional planning across the state, and in particular in Perth and Peel regions. I'm very conscious now, regardless what spin anyone wants to put on it, is that planning as in the past cannot continue. It is no longer business as usual. It can't be, and if it is, there will be dramatic social, environmental and economic costs, not perhaps for our generation, but there will be for future generations, and that's a responsibility we all need to recognise. Thank you.
In essence, business as usual won't cut it, and we couldn't agree more. Now, can I please ask the panellists to come up and join with Eric so that we can get into the Q&A session. So Gal McGowan, the Director-General of the Department of Planning, the Reece Waldock ring-in, Graham Doyle from the Department of Transport, and we really appreciate him coming in. Reece was very confident that he could answer any question that came along on transport issue, and Sally Braidwood from Ipsos. Now, I apparently, according to my staff, always muck up the Q&A, so I've been given very strict instructions. There are 4 roving microphones around the room. If you've got a question, put your hand up. One of the girls will come to you and they will coordinate rather than me trying to coordinate from here, because apparently I'm not very good at it. Now, I will let you know that there is media present in the room, and we're also recording all of the Q&A session, and that ultimately will be up on our website. So if you do ask a question, please give us your name and the company that you're representing. And I get to ask the first question of Gal McGowan, which is, what are the challenges to implementing what is a very comprehensive and quite a sobering plan?
We probably... Ooh, is it going to work? Might have to have it done by Friday, Meredith, I think. Look, we're not underestimating the challenges. This, as Erica said, is a very much a long-term plan. What we have done and are doing across government is actually probably the greatest amount of cross-government coordination we have had for many years, and I think it's also worth reminding people that the frameworks that we've put out are for the first time in many, many years identifying where a lot of those logical fits are. But I don't think we can underestimate what's gone on in the past as well, and Eric probably more than me knows that it's through things like the Metropolitan Regional Improvement Fund that we've actually been strategically acquiring land and planning for a lot of these future areas of growth for decades, not just for months, and planning through into the future. So I think it is a matter of making sure all of the arms of government, and that includes local government and federal government, work together. We work with the community, and I think as part of that, it's actually being realistic about what we can afford. I think everyone keeps on saying, pick me, and their piece of infrastructure is the best and the biggest and the brightest. We're not in a 24-hour instant gratification society. We're in it for the long haul, and I think we're well on the way.
That's good. Now I'm going to ask Graham a question about this need for integrated land use and transport planning. So we've obviously seen a very comprehensive approach to land use planning, and there are some corridors and there is some infrastructure around transport, but obviously it's the key issue for the future according to the survey. So where does Department of Transport fit in all of this?
And I can attribute everything to Reece, I believe. Thanks, Marion. Certainly it's our work on the transport planning for 3.5 million is very much aligned with the planning documentation that has come out, so that's the first thing. We have commenced that work. We've got the data now. Eric mentioned the importance of the data, so we've got that from the planning documents. And put that into our transport model. So that was very much the first step in that. And now the task, of course, is to interpret that data and take the employment and population and where people live and where they're going to work so that we can connect those two up in particular. So in terms of what we are actually doing, so the modelling is, as I said, the first step, and that has commenced. The other key elements of that 3.5 million transport plan will be the mass transit network, and we've all heard the importance of public transport in the people's minds in Perth, so that's a very big part of it. Obviously the road network is another major part of our getting around. And the third element, which will probably get less attention in the overall scheme of things, but still a very important element, is the transport demand management. And that's encouraging people to change their behaviours, to get out of their cars, to use public transport more so we can get a greater mode share, and to use the active transport measures more as well. So cycling in particular, which has been growing in recent times, and walking around as well if there is the infill, particularly in the CBD region, where more people can actually walk to their place of work. So they're the key elements of it. The demand management will certainly include cycling as part of one of those strategies. We have engaged Patrick, which is the Planning and Transport Research Centre, to assist us in particular with the mass transit work. They've commenced their engagement and are starting to put some of that thinking as to where the major corridors need to be. Obviously we have some major corridors already, but when we're talking 3.5 million, a city about double the size we've got now, there will need to be more corridors, so thinking is going into that. And similarly with the road network as well, there will probably need to be at least one more river crossing that comes into the scheme of things, and some other major road networks on top of the networks that we've got already. So in terms of our time frame, we're working towards around about the end of the first quarter next year to have that ready for government for consideration.
Okay, I'm sure there's questions out there. So where's the first question? We've got someone, Ray Tame from Armidale.
Thanks. Thank you, Marion. Ray Tame, City of Armidale. Probably directed it more to Gail and to Eric. And this is a question that comes from somebody who totally agrees we need a plan for 2050 and we need everyone in this room to be working towards it, otherwise we won't even get close. The employment self-sufficiency targets for the southeast and the northwestern sectors of Perth are set at 60.9% for 2050. The Perth average, of course, will be 85%. So we're really accepting that they're the areas that most of the people in the new developing sector, or most of the new residents of Perth, are going to live. Surely that demands that we are going to have a far greater focus on getting those people to jobs in the longer term. 60.9% is actually a 13% increase in both of those sectors. It's not going to be easy to attain, but if we accept that the people of those two regions are going to have far less employment self-sufficiency, surely we accept we've got to have greater emphasis on the infrastructure that gets them to jobs in other areas. And just a second part to it, Central Perth is going to have 139% self-sufficiency, and we all agree we should be trying to achieve greater infill, greater population in Central Perth. Perhaps we should accept lower employment self-sufficiency in that area, closer to 100%, and more jobs out in the outer areas where the people are going to live. That's not contributing to sprawl, it's just accepting that Perth at 2050 is going to be a 3.5 million, and we've got to try and get more equity over the metropolitan area. Jobs and where people are going to live. Thanks.
I'll start, and I'm sure Eric will continue on. Yeah, look, I agree with you, Ray, and certainly that notion of getting the reverse commute going, making sure we actually have a better connection between people living much closer to where they work. They're all parts of the answer to the jigsaw puzzle of making for a more sustainable city overall and a more sustainable transport system. I think we haven't had the luxury of being like a Portland or Seattle where we suddenly have a Microsoft or an Amazon spring up somewhere that gives us that reverse commute, so we've got to work harder at it. One of the key aspects of the Perth and Peel at 3.5 suite of documents is actually identifying land for industrial use, and I think sometimes in our push to talk about density and livability, we forget just how important industrial land is, and creating those opportunities for different forms of employment and different industry bases. It came up in the study about diversification. It also came up in terms of the sorts of things that people value, and increasingly we're valuing a lifestyle. We like the space, we like the options, but I think people are very much ready to trade some space for place and have more time in their lives to do the things that they want to do.
Eric, you'd like to continue on? It's on. Should be on.
On. Go. Yes, it is. Yes, look, I agree with what Gail said, and I can understand where Ray's coming from. I mean, as the population grows in these corridors, because of other choices they'll have, they will, if the offering is there in the sub-regional centres, will go there, particularly in terms of the health industry, the professional services industry, etc., as well as retail, which is already occurring. And that's always been part of the objective behind sub-regional centres. There will always be more jobs for a long, long time in terms of the Perth CBD and the outer and the inner ring, as I call it, and that's to be accepted. But also bearing in mind you've got significant population growth in those corridors, and I think there's hope there. And I'm going to give you a good example, and I'm going to quote back to you, Ray, you coming to see me in my office at the City of Swan. The eastern region has a very high sustainability rate. That happens over time with diversity of employment, industrial areas, as Gail said, but also service delivery. And that's now really solid. That will happen in Armidale over time, but you can't build Rome in a day, in this case Armidale. But it is occurring, and that's why we use and encourage and support bodies such as the Metropolitan Regional Development Authority and work that Landcorp, as well as the other private sector, has done, and the initiatives you've done down in Armidale, such as Hyundai or whatever. Those things will locate in those areas. So it's not all doom and gloom, it's making the most of the opportunities. And each sub-regional centre will only have its own point of difference, depending on the corridor makeup. And so it won't be all there when you retire, Ray, and I'm in the grave, but it will happen, okay? Rest assured.
That's heartening, I'm sure. Okay, next question.
Yes. Kevin Trent from the City of South Perth, also Deputy Chair of the Rivers Regional Council. You've probably heard me before, and my question is, we're going to have 3.5 million living in the metropolitan area. As we all know, the Waste Authority are trying to encourage us to have 3 rubbish bins, recyclable, protrusible waste and the green waste. My question is, are provisions being provided within the scheme for plants to treat these by-waste of our homes? I understand the population out in the country are not enthusiastic about having Perth's waste dragged out into those country areas. York, for instance, I was up there on the weekend, big signs up, we don't want Perth's waste. North Bannister site is rapidly filling. Where else are we going to go? The country people don't want your rubbish in their backyard.
All right. I know that was a big issue in the Robson report, talking about having a statewide approach to waste management, because at the moment it's at a local or regional level. So, Eric, what's your perspective?
It is a key issue. My first comment is waste transcends boundaries, Kevin. We all contribute to waste, no matter where we live in the state. But again, in terms of we were looking very closely at that, it hasn't gone away in terms of our thinking. It's something which we need to address. Wherever it's in the Perth and the Peel regions, it's getting the appropriate site, but we need to have sites which are close to good transport, and also look at the total, I'll call it waste energy cycle, in how that's addressed. And it's something we've got to address through the Waste Management Authority. But it's certainly a key issue for the future. We do have a major site, as you're aware, Kevin, in terms of the Eastern Metropolitan Regional Council, but that's only one aspect. We certainly need one north and south of the river. South of the river is problematic. It probably won't be in the Peel region, but close by, in my view. But it's something we've got to address in terms of our immediate future planning. Thank you.
And if I can add a little bit there, certainly we have been working with the Waste Authority, and I think some of those alternative forms of disposal and waste to energy plants, etc., and some I think have been mooted for the Kwinana industrial strip in the past. I mean, there's a combination of recycling, better use, etc., but as well recognising that we need economies of scale, and as Eric said, some of these issues transcend boundaries, and sometimes to get those economies of scale, and it's really pleasing to see some of the local governments banding together, because I think the only way we're going to make some of these alternatives work is actually getting that cooperative effort across the board. Thank you.
From a Committee for Perth perspective, we've done an extrapolation out of waste generation now, and if we do nothing differently, at 3.5 million we'll be generating more waste than New South Wales currently does at the moment with a greater population. So we have to find a sustainable solution, that's for sure. Next question.
Yeah, hi, it's Anna Kelderman from Shape Urban. I guess most people in the room would actually consider this plan to be forward-thinking and really quite strategic, but my question is for Gail. How do we, the converted, take this to the local governments and put ourselves in front of the community and their expectations and their outrage to get this plan delivered?
I suppose I feel a sense of optimism from, say, the Ipsos report and the Committee for Perth work, that I actually think we've recognised, or are recognising, we're growing up, and I think sometimes we take too much of a deficit approach. Yeah, we've got some people out there that certainly value what they have now. We're not asking necessarily everyone to change. We're saying a lot of what we're seeking in the Perth and Peel at 3.5 can actually be achieved with a relatively small but more strategic shift to where we place people and how we house people, etc. It doesn't mean that everyone suddenly has to be in a salmon pink block of flats in the suburbs. You know, there are lots of good choices. But I do think one of the things, and our Minister is particularly keen on this notion of the look and feel of the design, and I think developers, we as communities, everyone actually has to be working together to make sure we get the best possible outcomes in the most appropriate locations, because that in itself will bring people along. Certainly when I've travelled or when I've spoken to people, you almost need to build that groundswell of, oh, we want one of those, because people start to see the benefit of actually having whether it be an activity centre, whether they have the access to restaurants, to cafes, to movie theatres, to outdoor space, etc. And all of a sudden you've got a groundswell. And I was standing at the window before, just as we were waiting to come in, listening to the raft of voices looking out over at the Elizabeth Quay. Now you're starting to see some water in there, saying, oh, this is looking good, isn't it? So I think we underestimate what it is that we've got in Perth and Peel and in Western Australia, and it was really pleasing to see the research starting to say people are realising that we've actually got it pretty good, and we need to recognise that. Thank you.
So, Sally, I might ask you to reflect on a couple of what were to me surprising results, that car is less important into the future and a low-density future is less important.
It's a shift we've seen in a few projects over recent times. Certainly we did some work where we looked specifically at higher density living, and as I said, it certainly came through as a dirty word. High density is a dirty word for people. There's a lot of misconception and and miseducation, I suppose. There's not a good understanding of higher density versus high density. People in their minds have Gold Coast style high rises and the antisocial behaviour that comes with them. What they don't have in mind is closer communities, greater access to transport, a lot of the amenities that Gail was just talking about. So there's a real opportunity around education for what the benefits are from a community point of view and a lifestyle point of view that can come from that higher density, less car orientated approach to life.
Eric, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, as Sally, I see quite a bit of change going around. When I drive around, I mean, there's change happening in Melville, there's change happening in Swan, there's change happening in Mandurah. It's perhaps not highlighted as much, but I do think in terms of even medium density, I really shudder when people talk about high density because we haven't really got high density in Perth. We've got very low density, but it really gets back to good urban design. And that's something the Minister and the Commission and the Department is quite strong on in making sure we get the best possible design, and that's why I mentioned the place planning as well as urban design. I mentioned the three-dimensional approach, looking at how we activate those spaces in the right location with access to cafes, etc. And I think, from my experience, these demands will occur increasingly over time as communities change. I mean, unless someone can show me how I can stop ageing, I will be older tomorrow. And that I've noticed even in planning rural areas, people's views change over time. Might be 5 years, might be 10 years, but in pockets. And as I indicated in my address, when you really examine demographics, unless we're going to have a lot of old quasi-retirement villages with major social and economic impacts, we've got to facilitate this change of lifestyle, not only for more elderly people. We're going to have a crisis in terms of age accommodation, probably within 15, 20 years, but equally the younger people are choosing for a different type of development to perhaps I did when I was younger, and that will grow. It will grow in terms of population growth and it will grow in terms of the ageing demographics.
Sure. Next question. Looking around, can I see one? No one got a question? Just a gentleman here.
Thanks. Brett Woodgosh from MRA. So it's probably not quite the appropriate question because it's not to do with MRA. But Eric, I was very intrigued by your outline of the area that you thought the growth would occur. And I agree with you entirely in terms of it's probably within those circulating freeway systems. But beyond that area, which is mostly a grid system that came along before our planning policies in the 70s, is a collection of suburbs that were designed around the old conventional neighbourhood with cul-de-sacs and internalised shopping centres. The West Australian Planning Commission introduced livable neighbourhoods, and after that we went back to the grid pattern. But it seems to be an area that's kind of missing in terms of planning and planning direction. Do you think that's an area we need to look at, or is it kind of an area we just need to stay out of for the time being?
No, Brett, I'd agree it's an area that we need to look at, but we have to be very considered in how we analyse that and where we look at those solutions. Because I think if we just ignore it, we're going to ignore demand in the future. So as I said before, we should be planning ready where possible. But, you know, prioritisation is a key too. Can't do it all in one hit, but I would not say that you put those issues to the back burner and say they don't exist. They need to be looked at.
Eric, you picked up on your presentation before this sort of sense of the public open space and people having backyards, etc. So there's been a shrinking lot size on the fringe, and some of the research that we've done said that the most valuable suburbs will actually be in that inner ring where they've got a good block size, so they're really good for family housing into the future. So do you want to comment a little bit on the shrinking block size out on the fringe and what that might mean to the quality of life for future generations, and then this sense of having the 800 to 1,000 square metre block into the future for family housing?
I think the issue there is making sure we keep a appropriate balance. I think in the outer suburbs, one of the deficits has been, again being wise in hindsight, is the loss of greening. And I think in looking back, the loss of greening in some developed suburbs, and we went and had a look at a number of these through commissioners, is that good intent in terms of narrowing road reservations to improve opportunities, but also economics of scale. But equally, it's in how we treated those road reserves. I was very fortunate to go down and have a look at some developments. I won't name exactly where they are in the city of Rockingham. And I was quite surprised at the difference just between a couple of blocks under livable neighbourhoods, where footpaths were treated differently, wider or less width. The greenscapes was treated differently. In other words, the green environment got squeezed. Now that, in my mind, was not a result I would seek from an urban design perspective. I felt there was, but it was probably because you looked at one aspect solely on its basis, like a footpath, so on a road verge, and even from a maintenance point of view, going back to my local government days, I had queries on it. I then looked at the functionality of the road, not only in terms of a traffic or vehicle movement provider, but in terms of its total context, and then looked at the property. So I think on both sides of the equation, we have to relook at that to make sure we get a better balance. And I think sometimes we lose perspective by looking at an element solely without looking at right across. And so when I said urban design, I just did not mean urban design purely from a narrow perspective of, I'll call it unit development. I'm talking about urban design of streetscapes, which add to livability. I mean, I was brought up in Subiaco, 20-metre road reserve, great streets, but the functionality of that street is no longer what it was when I was there as a teenager. I'd dare kick a football down that street. I'd be up for a big damage because of all the parking in the area on the streetscape. But at least you had the greenery which you could manage, and it still worked. We had footpath both sides of the street. We had greenery. We had still off-site parking, and I think we've lost a bit of the three-dimensional perspective there rather than looking at two-dimensional. And so I think we've got to go back and relook at that.
Sure. Question? Yes, down here.
Ray Glickman from Amana Living Aged and Community Care. It's very pleasing actually today to hear so much emphasis on the ageing of the population, both in the survey and in the comments that people have made, and that's great. And I can see the smiles there, but I'm not going to ask the question you expect me to. I'm interested in some aspects of traffic demand management. And I think one missed opportunity we clearly have is in relation to school-related traffic and transport. And I would have thought we would be crying out for some more creative ways of dealing with those peaks that we have. Then I think the second question I have is about whether you see that ride sharing, new approaches to ride sharing is going to be part of reducing the demand for or traffic on the road, and also the demand for other forms of transport.
Just on the schools one to start with, there is a program that we run out of Department of Transport that is around connecting to schools. So our people do go out and work with schools on getting more active transport there rather than the mums and dads dropping off their children by car, to use other mechanisms to get there, walking, cycling, and public transport if it is a distance to travel. So there certainly is a program there available now. Obviously we can't do every school at once with the resources, but it does exist. So that's one thing. The second element in terms of demand management into the future, just trying to think, can you just say that second element of that question again? It's just skipped my mind. Ride share. Yep. Okay.
How much is that going to
So
play a
one of the
role?
elements of the I just tried to get there. One of the elements of our 3.5 million transport plan will be to look at some of the technologies in the future. Eric's already mentioned it's not just business as usual. So apart from the key elements of that planning document that I talked about, we will certainly look at technologies of the future. What the future may look like in terms of ride sharing, We've had a certain company come in and causes a little bit of consternation with our taxi industry at the moment. So that is part of the research that is also going into the 3.5 million transport plan. And as we go longer out, of course, we've got trials happening now on autonomous vehicles. So at some stage, by the time we get to 3.5 million, I think they might be pretty prominent in our streetscape. So that's part of the thinking of that transport plan as well.
So I had the very unpleasant experience of leaving the office at 5:30 on a cold, wet night and followed a convoy of buses, some damp cyclists and some pedestrians taking their life into their own hands going up Walcott Street. And so I understand some of the inner city suburbs that have taken the density pressure are now feeling a bit aggrieved that there's not an underpinning transport solution for them. Did you want to make any comment about that?
Where do I go here? There is thinking being done. It's thinking more now than for the 3.5 million, but obviously everything translates into the future in any case. But and some of the streets you mentioned, particularly the central northern corridor, for example, some of the thinking that we're starting to do is some of those corridors coming into the city, which ones are better suited to buses in terms of public transport, and which ones do we really set aside for cars to come in? So rather than just a splat, open slather, all mix it up and whoever gets there first wins. Some of the planning over the next few years will be around those corridors and giving priority in terms of bus priority in particular. There's one down Beaufort Street at the moment. There will probably be more into the future, in the not too distant future as well. In terms of giving bus priority down some of those corridors and other corridors as they come into the central area around the city as well. And of course, giving some of the more major routes some priority to the vehicles. The other element, and you mentioned cyclists, is we had a cycling imagineering workshop around 6 months or 5 months ago with some international experts coming around as well. And part of the work that's coming out of that is what we're calling bicycle boulevard projects. So there will be a couple of demonstration projects coming up over the next few months that we're engaging with some local governments on to try and make some of those more, not the major highways, of course, because there's a bit of a clash between major highways and cars and bicycles, but some of the roads along that follow similar corridors but are not the main drag, and having some demonstration projects and making them a priority for cycling rather than people doing rat runs to try and beat the traffic on the main drag.
Sure. Any other questions? Just looking out. You're a quiet bunch. You're giving them a very easy time. Quite surprised. So Gail recently went on a trip and went to see some of highly livable cities that are probably a little bit bigger in population than us and had some stellar growth. Do you want to reflect a little bit on what you learnt during that tour?
Yeah, thanks, Marion. Look, I suppose one of the reassuring things was how much we're doing right, and that each city has some fantastic, and the cities that I went to in particular were Portland, Seattle and Vancouver. Each of them has its high points. Portland does transport in the CBD amazingly well for a population of 600,000, but you go outside the CBD area and all the same sorts of issues and probably multiplied than we have here. So I think, it's not all roses. And in fact, I tell the story of Portland, which is a complete diversion, Marion, sorry, but we had 6,000 planners in Seattle for a World or American Planning Association conference, but craft brewing attracted 10,000 to Portland while we were there, and we didn't go. But Vancouver in itself, again, we quizzed particularly a couple of planners who have been here and accredited with Vancouverism and making Vancouver the most livable city in the world many years, running about what we should be doing differently in Perth. Their answer was broadly along the lines of not very much differently. You don't appreciate what you've got. Perth makes our mouths water because it is just so positive and so good. They did say we could do a little bit more in the public transport space, and I think that's accepted. They made some interesting observations about making sure with our expansive public space that is activated, and that in fact you actually need to have things for people to do, to use open space to the best of its ability. But the other key one was actually making better use of existing infrastructure and existing space. So schools going up, not out, schools being built next to ovals, using buffer areas and things for more active recreation. So just actually rethinking some of the things we've always done because we've had the space to be able to do them any which way we want, and saying when that luxury is gone, how do we re-engineer, how do we reimagine?
So, Eric, in your presentation you referred to place, and that's something that planners for worldwide talk about, having a place that is recognisable, is a destination, there's things to do, low cost, no cost, as well as expensive things to do. And Gail mentioned before, just outside the waterfront there, Elizabeth Quay's coming into its own. How many more great places do we need across the metro region? And how many have we got now, and how many more do we need to have? That's a question without notice.
Sure is. Great places. I think there's significant opportunity to revitalise Fremantle. I think that's a asset which is underrated and needs to explode, and I think there's opportunities there which can really reposition Fremantle as a sub-regional centre. I think there's areas which is already starting to occur around Rockingham in the foreshore. Foreshore for a long time in Rockingham, and I went there as a kid, was a forgotten place. Starting to be reactivated. I think the city's moving that along. It went backwards because of the splitting of what I call the CBD of Rockingham. It wasn't a CBD per se, but the activity centre. I think there's ongoing aspects down in Mandurah. They're developing some good places, not just in Mandurah itself, which was developed by Landcorp around the area there. And I think there's opportunities up the coast, Yanchep. And I think there's good places being developed now. Whiteman Park is developing as a significant regional open space activity. The visitor numbers is increasing every year. And there's obviously, there's small places. I mean, look at the way the City of Perth has changed in terms of the bars and the huge community debate about bars. I mean, it is so active now, and I had a friend of mine come from the Eastern States last week, had gone into the City of Perth, and he says, God, what's happened here? Sometimes we don't appreciate what is actually happening in our own backyard, but I think places don't have to be big and flamboyant. They can be just discreet places. I mean, there's issues we could do around the Perth Concert Hall. We've got a place there which is largely brick paving, very little used, got a face to the river. People would die for that normally. So I think there's really re-looking at these opportunities that exist. It doesn't have to be massive. There's small opportunities which all add up to give a major synergy.
And Sally, a lot of the things that came up as being very positive insertions in Perth in the last 10 years were basically low cost, no cost. They were regulatory changes. So did you want to reflect a little bit on those?
I think it ties in a lot with what we've been talking about in terms of people not appreciating what is here, what they have, and change can happen very rapidly from a lot of perspectives, but from the residential perspective, people have a certain idea of Perth, what you can and can't do in Perth, what you go to Melbourne for, what you go overseas for. And certainly it's always incredibly enlightening when we have clients come and watch focus groups, and we'll have the conversations with the general population about what happens in Perth, what can you do in Perth, what can't you do here. And when it's what we're doing every day, whether it's people in local government or you're in private enterprise, you know what is happening and what changes are taking place. And there's that gap between perception and reality for the residents. And so we're starting to see the shift. People are certainly more aware. Deregulation of shopping hours, changes to smaller bar licensing has had a big impact, and people are catching on in a sense, but it's changing that behaviour. So getting people past doing what they always used to do and the perceptions they've always had to really embracing a changing city, a different city, and behaving differently. Doing, if you're going to the football, arriving earlier, doing other things before and after. if you're going to see a movie, doing that in a different place, changing what you do for fun and recreation based on a changing environment around you. So again, it's that education process and getting people to overcome that barrier and experience something different and form a new reality of their city.
And I think the second most positive thing that people thought was the festivals, particularly Fringe. So there's a completely new insertion in the last couple of years. Doesn't require any big stellar infrastructure, but it just sort of takes over the city, and people have responded really well to that. All right, is there a burning last question out there? Our chairman would like to ask a question. Holly, could you bring... No. Sorry, up the back, and then we'll come to you, John, and then you'll be last.
No one said anything about landscape architecture and our contribution to improving Perth. Dreaming to have the urban forest, bringing the overhanging power lines under the ground would definitely help in greening our city. So can we continue dreaming, or can we do something about it?
I live in the city of Canning. I'd love to have underground power. Eric, would you like to kick that off?
I did mention greening.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that needs to be enhanced in terms of our streetscapes and the other areas. In fact, the department has been looking at that closely on behalf of the Commission. But it's a fundamental aspect, not only in terms of amenity, but also microclimates. And so I hope I hit the nail on the head there. Okay.
And Gail, you want to make a comment?
And look, I'd love nothing more than underground power lines, where I live likewise. But I think that hits the nail on the head in lots of ways about the challenge we have. I think Eric mentioned 870 square kilometres of metro area. We have spread ourselves so thinly. There are so many demands, so many needs in the infrastructure space. We cannot afford to maintain it like that. Government can't do it alone, and the private sector has certain things that continue with what private sector could and should pay for, and what we're prepared to pay for out of our hip pockets as taxpayers as well. So we have this list that is so great of would be great to have, and we know that they're lifestyle enhancing. Some of them governments are able to bite the bullet and go and do, but I think it underlines that need to fundamentally change some of our expectations and perceptions and actually do some refreshing and renewal to make the most of what we've got, because otherwise we actually have to really question whether we actually are going to be able to continue to afford the lifestyle that the survey has shown we value so much.
Sure. Chairman.
Thank you, Marion. Holly's told me to keep this short. Congratulations to you all. This has been a terrific discussion, and the planning is fabulous. So yesterday we heard that the opposition is going to have a debate around Metro Rail. And since the election, we've had light rail on again, off again, and perhaps not on again. We look into Victoria, there was a change of government, and we had a major bit of infrastructure, road infrastructure, undertaken by a previous government, cancelled at significant cost to the taxpayer. We're having a fascinating debate about freight transport into Fremantle as to where that should occur. There's a lot of issues around infrastructure which still seem to be open for a considerable amount of debate. And I remember back at the beginning of the Barnett government, there was a Commission for Audit which argued that we should see a lot more coordination of planning for infrastructure across government. Other jurisdictions introduced infrastructure committees, and the opposition said if it were to be elected, we'd see an infrastructure committee established for the planning of infrastructure across Perth. So could you just give us some insight as to how effective and widespread and coordinated is infrastructure planning across government, and do you see that improving over time? That was a short question.
Yes, thank you for your short question, John. It is improving. One of the tasks I've set for myself as chair was to improve not only dialogue but understanding and integration of infrastructure agencies. I think we've come quite a long way, but we've got to go further. I'm working on a model now for improving infrastructure planning. It's got to be done. It can't be ignored. It's also important to look at the hierarchy of infrastructure, if I could put it that way, John, from state, local, sub-regional. But I do think there's a acceptance now that we have to look at that integration of infrastructure far better. One of the issues, I think, in terms of, and this is a personal view, so it's not government, I'm not speaking on behalf of government here, when people talk about heavy rail or light rail or buses, my experience, and I've just come back from overseas, is that you need to look at those elements within an integrated approach. How it will work as a system, not just simply announcing this is a route here. How we maximise the various elements of, for instance, public transport infrastructure, just like freight infrastructure. How do they all fit together and work as a system, not simply saying, well, if we do this, it'll all work and all this area will resolve itself. It is not that simple. I've just come back from Barcelona, 3.5 million people, great lifestyle, highly diverse, but they do have an integrated transport system. And that also includes high-speed rail as well as low-speed rail. It also includes light rail. And I looked at all those aspects, even though I was on a social trip, much to my wife's disdain. But I came back totally convinced we need an integrated approach within government, working with private sector people as much as possible to deliver that and to make sure that we look at this like a jigsaw. There's this bit that goes into place, this bit goes into place, and it all comes together rather than a fragmented approach, which perhaps we've looked at in the past.
Or perhaps politics has determined. Did you want to make a closing comment, Gar?
I was just going to add on to that. One of the things that Eric has done with the frameworks for Perth and Peel at 3.5, which I think actually reinforces those comments, is that with the frameworks and as they're finalised, we actually have a really good blueprint for working out what bits of infrastructure need to be better coordinated to deliver on that vision for Perth and Peel at 3.5, and that is the work program for the Infrastructure Coordinating Committee, and I think you'll see some significant advance there.
All right, I'm going to draw the panel session to a close. If I could ask the panellists to stay there. Liz Carey, can I ask you to come up and give the vote of thanks? And while that's happening, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our next project, which is called Get a Move On. It's a little bit cheeky. It's definitely about public transport into the future. And what we want to know is as much what the business community thinks as what people think. So I just want to take you through a couple of quick slides. And the first one is, what does business as usual tell us? And you heard Eric say we just can't continue to do what we've always done. So we've had a look at some of the scenarios for Perth at the future if we don't do things differently. And we're going to be outer suburban dominated. We're going to have more than 2 million people living out in those fringe locations. So you can imagine what their expectations are going to be like in terms of road and rail. The commute costs are high coming from the suburbs into what is affordable country, and I say that in inverted commas because I think if the transport was added to the cost of the mortgage, you'd see more people moving closer in. Infrastructure Australia recently came out with its infrastructure audit and said Perth is on track to become the most congested city in the country, and we really want to talk to the business community about what does that mean for them in terms of locational choices. They can be anywhere in Australia, probably anywhere in the Asian region. We also want to know what it means for people in terms of quality of life. We have a love of the car, and the predictions are that we're going to have 1.5 million more vehicles on the road, and we're going to have crush capacity on the Mandurah to Joondalup line. So it's not a good scenario for business as usual. But we do see a bright future for Perth. We've had a good mode shift. There is a preference for people to take public transport when it's convenient and efficient and reliable and safe. So there can be more mode shift made there. We've seen an increase in people cycling, actively walking to work. So we think that can be better leveraged too. As I said, people could make location choices if they thought about the mortgage payment and the transport cost together. But of course, this all has to be underpinned by a good investment in public transport into the future. So that's a little bit about what we think. Looking at the external evidence, as I said, Infrastructure Australia has given this, I think, frightening view that we're going to be the most congested city in Australia, and saying that congestion costs are going to cost the Australian economy $16 billion by 2031. You've heard from Ipsos today that people feel let down, that we're planning well for the future in terms of public transport, and 89% of respondents do want to see that integrated multimodal future that Eric was talking about. Also, RAC and CCI talk about the cost of congestion to businesses as well, and as I said, couple that with quality of life issues. And that's been one of Perth's greatest competitive advantages, to just have this great quality of life. So what we're going to do is, with Get a Move On, is identify and quantify community and business impacts for decreased mobility today and impacts for the future. We're going to identify the most appropriate solutions, so we're going to look within and external. And we're going to facilitate discussion and debate about Perth's transport future, and we hope to touch many of you as we go through that process. The aim ultimately is within 12 months to release a report that's completely evidence-based in the usual way that the Committee for Perth does its work, and that will underpin a new integrated and innovative solution and strategic approach for the efficient movement of people across Perth in the 21st century. So we're really looking for funding partners to get that project away. So if any of you are interested in getting involved, please let me know. Something like this is going to be expensive. One of the first steps we do is hoping to engage Ipsos to do community-based surveys as well as some focus group testing for us, and then we hope to get out and do the business interviews ourselves and at least publish the results of that, just so we can see some of the things that you were talking about before, that people are part of the solution to this puzzle. So it's not for government alone. We've got some power in our hands, and if we all think we're going to drive out of our driveways in the morning and drive to underground car parking in our building, we're all going to add to the problem, so we want to be part of the solution. So on that note, Liz, please can you give the vote of thanks? But on behalf of Committee for Perth, I thank you all very much for what was a very engaging session. And Eric is gorgeous. He rang me on Friday and he said, "This is what I'm going to say, and are you happy with it?" And I love that you are so respectful of our role and that we play in the future of Perth. So thank you.
It's my pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks today. Thank you to our panellists, Gail McGowan from the Department of Planning, Graham Doyle from the Department of Transport, and Sally Braidwood from Ipsos. And of course, thank you to Eric Lumsden, Chair of the West Australian Planning Commission, for taking the time today to talk about Perth and Peel at 3.5 million. RAC aims to deliver a better world of mobility for its members and believes all Western Australians should be able to travel around their community in the safest, most sustainable and efficient way possible. Today we have heard that we need to plan now for our future land use and transportation needs, and it's not just the challenge of population. As Marion has just pointed out, that this year Infrastructure Australia has predicted that by 2031, 7 of the 10 most congested roads in Australia will be in Perth. In future-proofing the mobility needs of West Australians, transport and land use are inextricably linked forces. Managing the operation of the transport network is part of the response, but we also need to plan our cities so that people do not need to travel so far so often. Central to the plan is the need to create a more connected city. Perth is a great city, but we need to provide opportunities for people to work closer to home and to use alternative forms of travel to reduce the number of car trips. Western Australia faces enormous challenges in delivering the infrastructure and services we need to meet the demand being generated by population growth. But I'm confident by working together we can achieve a great future. Thank you for all joining us today, and please join me in thanking our speakers and the Committee for Perth for hosting this event. And I should add, Committee for Perth has some gifts for our panellists here to the left of the stage. Thanks.
All right, on that note, safe travels back to your offices. Think about the sustainable transport modes you could use to get there, and we'll see you at an event shortly.